I think one of the big challenges that we face in development is that what international agencies or international norms or international law even says and sometimes requires is not the same as what citizens themselves in particular countries want. And once we're in that situation, reasonable people can choose to go different ways. But I think for international agencies, we are law-bound organizations, but we also are organizations that try to take seriously the inputs of local citizens, voice issues, the contributions of citizens to their own well-being and to their own process of change is really important. So the work that I've done is really, with our colleagues in the Justice for the Poor program, has really stressed the legitimacy of the change process as being really key. You can deal with lots of complicated things happening and even lots of disappointing outcomes, because oftentimes there are winners and losers that are created out of reform processes. People will deal with that if they perceive that the process of change is itself a legitimate one. People get very legitimately upset when they think that change is being imposed upon them from the outside, or the change is being imposed that is alien to their sense of what is important. And gender issues can fall very much into that category of things that international law, international norms would say there should be gender parity, gender equality in that space. Other countries would have very different views on that. There isn't a technical fix to that. There isn't an answer to that. There is only an answer that constituencies internationally and domestic resolve and articulate together. And that's why I stress the importance of having the change process imbued with a strong sense of legitimacy, because that's really important for managing that. In Vanuatu, for example, a country our team worked in Melanesia for many years, the tradition is that all the council of elders be all men, right? And we went to several meetings where a room full of 50 people who was responsible for the governance of this particular area, all of them were men, right? So what does one do in that space? Do we say, well, this was 50 men is what local participation, voice and accountability requires? Do we defer to that? Or do we come in from the outside with a development agenda that says, oh no, 25 of those should be women because that's what we believe is the right thing to do? And we can get funding for all sorts of programs that will try and promote that. We can invoke all sorts of everything from evidence to precedent to law as a basis on which we might argue for those changes to be enacted. But it's not obvious how one engages with that. As I said, reasonable people can come at that issue from very different standpoints and reach different conclusions. But without predetermining what the outcome should be, I think we should be, as an organization, we the World Bank, should be cognizant of what the countries themselves have already signed up to by way of international agreements with the United Nations or with anybody else. I think that's a legitimate basis for arguing for what we should do, that if a country itself is a signatory to those agreements. But oftentimes what a national government has signed into law or by way of agreement is not how it's experienced at a local level. And most in cases of many of the Melanesian countries, the notion that they themselves are even citizens of a country that is a legitimate claimant of their identity and their loyalty and their resources is itself a stretch. So I keep coming back to this, sort of putting a very strong premium on the legitimacy of the change process, and then the outcome is what the outcome is, but it has local legitimacy, and if that can be sustained over time, then a lot of the process of dealing with contention can be acquired and incorporated into the way in which systems get managed. And that's things just keep getting more complicated in this business and people have to learn, citizens have to learn, governments have to learn, the private sector has to learn how to do these kind of deals, but in ways that are broadly perceived to be legitimate by all these different stakeholders. And if that doesn't happen, having something that in a narrow sense can be portrayed to a different constituency outside as being in adherence with an international norm is one source of legitimacy, but it's not the source of legitimacy for many local actors. So that's the the key issue, I think, is figuring out, and it's not obvious how one does it, but figuring out how and through whom a process of legitimacy can be cultivated and then sustained over time.